All right. Hi, everybody. I'm going to introduce you today to one of my good friends and colleagues, Dr. Chris Dean. Chris Dean is a continuing lecturer at the University of California, along with me and our other distinguished colleagues. And he is also the co-author of Terra Incognita textbook that we're using in our course, and the co-developer of this Writing 50 research writing course that focuses on urban legends, conspiracy theories, and hoaxes. So, hello, Chris.
Hey, Doug, how you doing?
Doing great.
Good.
We're going to go ahead and I thought maybe we'd start by just letting you say a few things about the course topic, the times we're living in.
Well, I couldn't think of a better course topic to be exploring in 2020, particularly when, we have everyone from the president to major news networks talking about fake news and what that is, and conspiracy theories in a time of crisis multiply, exponentially. So it's, I think, a really good time to look at it, and certainly even to look at, if anybody is so moved, I would just throw it out there, how we're thinking about COVID-19 and particularly the conspiracy theories and misinformation that tends to float around the very virus itself.
Absolutely. Yeah, talk about things online going viral.
Yeah, the analog is now our non-virtual reality. I mean, we're dealing with viruses and things that are mimetic, being broadcast at the same time. It's a very interesting time. This topic always changes, but it never gets old, and I think it's tremendously relevant.
Yeah, well, I never thought I'd see the term going viral become a metonymy, but here we are.
And yet, here we are.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to talk today with the students about surveys, and although surveys are optional for their research papers, perhaps it'd be a good idea to talk just a bit about why surveys can enhance a research study and what they add that other sources don't.
Well, I mean, having done surveys now for over 20 years in various forms, starting on paper and then moving to electronic surveys, I think, they provide that sort of primary research, which actually is non-recover. It's often called an APA non-recoverable research. So it's something that you as the researcher have direct access to, and it allows you to really sort of customize the questions that you want to ask about a research topic. And also the quality of it. So it's a qualitative sort of data that you're getting back. You're not going to necessarily be dealing as much in numbers, although you can, and there are ways of working with numbers, obviously, in surveys. But you're getting, with a survey, people's subjective responses, which are actually incredibly useful, and particularly if we're thinking about the psychological impact of urban legends, hoaxes, and conspiracy theories, to sort of explore how people view them and why they view them in the way that they do. I think a survey, even more so than an interview, is uniquely suited to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to go ahead and start the PowerPoint that we've developed, and I'll be sharing this with the students simultaneously so that they can follow along with us. So I'm going to share the screen that I'm using here for our PowerPoint. And as the subtitle says here in our title, a few basic ideas. So I guess I'll start with what's a survey, and what would you say is the primary difference between a survey and, say, just an interview?
Well, interviews limit you in some way to a smaller group, a smaller data set. Ultimately, they allow for sort of maybe increased depth in terms of response. So you will have like 10 people at tops that you could interview, and you might even do what are called focus group interviews, where you're going to have a group of people that you're interviewing at the same time. But that gives you a much smaller sample size, and sample size is obviously related to the validity and reliability of your data. So the larger the sample size, the more diverse it is, the more that you can account for issues of race, class, gender, and other demographic information, the more likely you are to actually have data that's representative of a larger population. So with a survey, you always talk about the sample and you talk about the population. So you want a good sample that represents the population being the large group of people that you're thinking about, and the sample being what you get.
Oh, let's
So,
get into the weeds here.
sure.
You know, some of the motivations for surveying and using surveys and research, we've listed a few here, such as testing a hypothesis using data from real opinions. And, you know, we're all familiar with things like the Pew Research poll or various polls that are conducted by newspapers around the country. How do they differ qualitatively from the sorts of surveys and polls that students can do for their smaller projects?
Well, I think, because with, Pew Research, and I mean, if you're thinking about even the political polls that we're seeing coming up right now, um, they're going to be much more rigorous, particularly on the front end. And what I mean by that is that they're going to make sure that their sample is really diverse. They have the money and the time and the work power to actually make that happen. So they're likely to be able to go across the entire United States. They're going to be sampling from various groups of people, various ages. Students can't do that because in some ways, when you do the survey work, particularly in writing 50, you're going to have to sort of surf off of your own sort of social networks, because that, particularly now in the COVID-19 world that we live in, you're not going to go out and administer a paper survey. You're going to be doing this online and using what's called actually oftentimes a convenience sample or a snowball sample. Convenience sample being, these are the people I could get. Snowball meaning you're going to ask people once they've surveyed to forward it to others, and so you get a larger number. The interesting thing though, Doug, is that having done this both for this class and then 109 SS, oftentimes people can get, if they're focusing on, say, UCSB or even college students, they can get a reasonable sample size and be able to make some, you know, um, guarded, but I think interesting claims about what their data says.
Hmm. Well, so if students have a small sample, which they'll certainly have something smaller than what they would hear about, like in a Nielsen poll or what have
Right.
you, should they just qualify that in their research preambles or their introductions by explaining the limits of their surveys?
Absolutely. You do it, I think, when you talk about your methods, and you do it at the end when you talk about the limitations of your research. And everybody does this, and it doesn't matter whether it's Pew or whether it's a student. You have to acknowledge this. The last thing we want to do, and I know you've talked a lot about this, Doug, is you don't want to cook your data. You don't want to make it seem representative of something that just can't simply represent.
Hmm. Well, let's move on through our PowerPoint here. Ethical considerations and primary research. There's quite a bit of text here, but what are some primary things as far as getting permission from people who are becoming part of a survey or whose quotes might be used in a research paper?
I think one of the things that you have to do is, even before they take the survey, is to have them on that initial page check off and say, I give you permission to use my data. And you have to do your best to promise as best you can anonymity through the survey. And this has there's a long history for why this is, but you want to make sure that people are not going to be exposed for the opinions that they hold, and that people aren't going to sort of be able to trace back. So I think the very first thing upon starting the survey is to have them check a box that says, I'm willing to let you use my data, and that they can withdraw their consent at any point in the process. These are very important things that are part of what we call human subjects in the academy. So when you work with people, you have to be respectful of them.
And so they could, for example, refer to subjects as subject A, subject B, or they could give them pseudonyms, right?
Sure, if you do. I mean, one of the advantages, though, of a survey is oftentimes you are going to create data. So you'll be using, and we'll get into this later, Likert scale, things from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And that gives you data and numbers to actually work with. Certainly part of what you collect is oftentimes very qualitative and textual. You can have text boxes and the like that you use and fill in. And then, yeah, you might say even just a respondent to the survey. I think the more you can keep it anonymized, less likely people are to track back, the better. And that's probably the primary ethical concern, is protecting anonymity and dignity of the people you're working with.
Hmm. Well, let's move on through. So as far as selecting a demographic or a population to work with, we've mentioned here in our notes, who are you planning to survey and how many people are needed to have a legitimate, relevant survey, and how are you going to actually access those people? And also another thing is just how long should surveys be so that they don't lose interest or just don't complete them? And then of course, we'll get to the specific kinds of questions you should ask. There's a lot there, but can we start by, first of all, just saying, how do you pick a population? How do you pick your demographic?
Well, I think particularly for students here in Writing 50, you're going to have to work with a demographic that you have immediate access to. So, if I'm a person who has worked a lot with people who are over the age of 60, and I have a large social circle that I can work with that sort of, just that age set, then I can do it. If I don't want to do it now. And the one thing I would say to everyone is, the one group that you probably do not want to work with, just because permissions get really fraught, are people under the age of 18.
Good
Don't
point.
don't work with children,
Mm.
particularly in this, because they cannot by law give their consent to
Excellent
doing
point.
a survey of any kind. It has to be consent from the parent or guardian.
Mhm.
So I think, it really comes down to, who do you know? And how many people are you going to survey? That, I think, again, depends oftentimes on the social network. So you're going to create a survey, you're going to have a link, and then you're going to post it. It's the one time in your life that Instagram is going to provide you more than just some cool pictures, or Twitter is going to provide you more than entertainment or despair. And it depends on your perspective which it's going to be. So the numbers, I think, you want to get a larger number. The larger number is typically better. And how are you going to survey people? It's all going to be via electronics. The length of the survey, I think you compose it and then you have to cut questions out. You don't want to have like a 20, 25-page survey that people are not going to do, particularly if there's no financial reward. Rule of thumb, I think for this class, and typically I said, if you can keep it to 10 and no more than 2 fill-in questions, that's a good rule of thumb to work with.
And by fill in, you mean where they're actually writing long
Right.
responses to open questions.
Exactly. The open questions, you want at best 2 of those, because those are the places where people check out. And you want people to complete the full survey to have data that's most useful and most reliable and most valid.
Great. Well, moving on to the kinds of questions that are helpful to ask and those that we don't want to ask. I guess we'll start with the ones that they should avoid. We've listed a few here, like biased questions, questions that assume what they ask, double-barreled questions, confusing or wordy questions, and then those that are utterly unrelated to what the research is about.
Yeah, I think the sneakiest one, I think, part of what you have to do is you have to write up the questions, and then, find another human being, whether it's a roommate, your parents, wherever you're at, run them by them and see what they think of them. That's really the big test that you can do, independent of whether you can do that sort of in a classroom setting or not. Um, the one that I think that's hardest to get at is the double-barreled questions.
And I have an example of a double barrel question, but looks like we may be frozen up here for a moment. So let's let that sort itself out. Chris, are you still there? Oh, there you are.
All right.
Yeah, we had a freeze up there for a moment. Not sure
Okay.
what happened. Yeah, did it freeze up on your end or was it on my end?
I saw probably just because of the way this is situated, I just saw you locking up and then.
Oh, okay. Doesn't happen often, but
Yeah, every now and again.
Network. All right, so I'll get back to that screen and maybe we'll just take it from the top there
Sure.
with the, yeah, all right,
All right.
put it back up there. And there we go. All right. So Chris, let's talk about the kinds of questions that you want to avoid.
Yeah. So, I mean, pretty good list here. The one thing that I think is not as clear, I mean, certainly you don't want to ask biased questions like, why are people who believe in conspiracy theories so stupid? Right? You don't want to do that. It assumes it's biased. Wordy questions, you wouldn't want to ask a question like, why would you want to do what things you want to do when you're considering conspiracies? You know, part of it is actually you're going to have to edit it. So one of the things I always say is run this by a live human being. Make sure that it scans well, whether it's a parent, somebody who owes you money, whatever it is that you can actually have them do. And the one thing I would say, and I know you have a good example of this, is the one thing that seems a little odd is double-barreled questions. So why don't you provide that example, Doug?
Sure. Yeah, let's just jump ahead. I think they might actually come in a slightly different. Well, here's one here. We'll just start with this. And the question being, well, what's wrong with this? And I think the one that we would say here is it's certainly a biased question that's
Yeah,
leading, it's trying to lead automatically to the answer.
right.
They're all roads lead to Rome here, right?
Yeah,
That
right.
iPods are horrible. Let's see what else we have here. Oh yeah, how do you feel about UFOs and extraterrestrial life? So that sounds an awful lot like a double barrel question.
Yeah. So we have two things going on. How do you feel about UFOs and how do you feel about extraterrestrial life? And when you see these things, you have to break them up into two questions and oftentimes ask yourself, what is the question I want to know?
And this also might be a good case in point where we need to narrow the research question itself.
Yeah,
Yeah, for example, someone might have a kind of a skeptical relationship with UFOs. They may think they're all hoaxes, but they might think there's a possibility of extraterrestrial life in microbial form or some other form.
exactly. So conflating two things also, is something you want. You want to be as precise as you can. And oftentimes you may even need to define parenthetically something like, what do you mean by UFO or what do you mean by extraterrestrial life? It's difference, as you said, between, the presence of something that's microbial and something that's, clearly sentient.
Well, that's a good bit of advice too about doing surveys and questionnaires generally is that when you have terms that your respondent may not be familiar with, go ahead and just offer a quick working definition for what you mean by that term.
Right. Exactly.
And then here we see an example of what looks like a very wordy question.
Yeah. Yeah, if you start using a semicolon, that's almost always an indication you've spent way too much time writing that one question.
Absolutely. Well, and then here's another one. So if we were, say, sticking with that topic of UFOs and extraterrestrial life, asking about the use of artificial sweeteners in junk food.
Yeah, no, I mean, we all know that saccharin is evil, but I mean, it's, I don't think it's quite on the level of, extraterrestrial abduction. So, part of it, yeah, is that focus. You always have to make sure that you're not going outside of your focus because people will not follow you and you can do damage to your data set.
Yeah, I don't know, Chris. Artificial sweeteners, sucralose, could it be a alien conspiracy?
My understanding is that at the time of the pyramids, they actually developed sucralose. The Greys did, and then brought it down, and then distributed, and then that technology was lost until very recently.
I think I saw that on TV too.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, very unrelated to research.
Yeah.
Well, here's one that looks like it's well portioned, at least for time. We're asking for a time response. And could you say a bit about this one?
So one of the things that you can do is often to think about something that's easily quantifiable, at least in our experience. So time is one such thing. So if I'm going to look into, in this case, iPods, I want to sort of break it down by time because this is something that people are more able to verify rather than something that's simply attitudinal. It's just one way to think about things in terms of how you craft what are the possible answers.
And it gives us a solid metric. And again, in this example, the actual time intervals are well portioned. So we don't see like A, less than 1 hour per day, B, 2 hours, C, 3 weeks, for,
Right,
option D to 10 weeks or more or something. We have it
right.
evenly spaced out.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's get on to Likert scaling, which is the preferred mode of survey giving and survey analysis throughout the world. Why is Likert scaling so useful to us?
I think in large part because it has an extensive research track record. So they've been using Likert scales for a very long time, and people also understand them. It's almost impossible to go through life, whether you're rating the meal that you got at the Outback Steakhouse to doing something more involved, like say the Eskies, you're going to have these Likert type scales that you're going to be familiar with. And um, they allow you to sort of surf on what people have done before, but also, as I said, there's a long track record of using them in research, and particularly research that's attitudinal.
So if we
Uh,
ask somebody to, or a group of people to rate their hamburger on a scale of 1 to 100, what happens there?
well, there's a lot of subjectivity. Also, that scale is so huge. Most Likert scales divide up rather evenly into five, and there's a very particular reason for the five. That asking to people to make distinctions 1 through 5, they tend to do a better and more consistent job. 1 through 100 is too much. What does it even mean, 1 through 100? It's more of a popular concept. That was a 100 level hamburger, right? But it tends to be very bimodal. It's 100 or it's 0.
Hmm.
So, psychologically, you want to think about how people are going to respond, but also, again, then you're dealing with numbers that are just too hard to parse.
So we're seeing here, this example of coffee, and looking at strongly disagree, disagree,
Right,
neither agreed or disagree, which is the neutral position, and then agree or strongly agree.
right. Go ahead, Doug.
Well, I was going to ask about the writing of those statements. So we're looking for statements that are declarative, right? We
Yeah,
want something that people can clearly understand and then respond to.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you want something that also, people are familiar with in a way. So using that scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree is something that people, as I said, have done before. It's almost impossible to not have done some sort of survey at some point in your life.
Mhm.
So yeah, and simple declarative statements, exactly. Rather than, a question with questions that follow it, that just simply becomes confusing.
So we have a little survey question for our students to take where they write a survey question as poorly as possible and then rectify it and make it a much better version of itself.
Mhm.
But maybe this would be a good time to go ahead and talk about how we actually do surveys. And I've mentioned to the students that I'm teaching this quarter about the use of SurveyMonkey. And
Mhm.
SurveyMonkey at surveymonkey.com is pretty self-explanatory, but it does have its limits, right? And you have an alternative. What are the limits of SurveyMonkey?
Well, the limits of SurveyMonkey are actually fairly numerical. So you can only have up to 40 responses. So that's going to shrink your sample size. And you can only have up to 10 questions. So, that just limits what you're going to do. The 10 questions may not be that important, but when you're shrunken down to 40 in terms of responses for the free, that really is actually a limitation on what you can do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, my advice to them, particularly since folks tend to use a lot of Google Docs and the Google Suite, is use Google Forms.
So can you give us a glimpse of what that looks like?
Absolutely. Let's see if I will try to share my screen here. Oh, host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh no, oh gosh, didn't know that.
Um,
Here, let's see, how do I do that?
it's
Security or,
Yeah, I think it's in sharing on the Zoom. Uh,
okay, let's see, rename, da, 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 da. So share screen, yeah, all right, I think I just got that fixed. Here we'll do a pregnant pause here and then we'll reset for editing. Okay, so Chris, can you please show us give us a glimpse of what it looks like when you're using Google Forms to do a survey?
sure, that's my fondest hope. Let's see if this is here now. again, fumble around a bit. Save. All right, so let's see. Here we go. All right. So now that we fumbled around, this is actually a Google form that I created for a class to actually serve. So it's pretty simple. You go into your Google account, and I'll just go back here, and you will have, you oftentimes have to hit more, but if you go back, you can actually create these forms, and forms essentially are Google's answer to a survey. So if I'll just do a new one right here and now. So if I click on form, it starts out like this. So you would title it up here at the top. You would want to give it some sort of description that befits what you're looking at, because it's always popular. Alien abduction. Then when you get down to the survey questions, so like I said, at first you're going to collect demographic data. So you get to choose how it looks. I can do multiple choice, I can do check boxes, drop down, linear scale that mimics the sort of Likert scale, checkbox grids. There's all sorts of ways to go, but initially you're probably going to say, you know, something about, you know, by clicking below on consent, you are giving the researcher permission to use your data in his, her, their research.
And you mentioned earlier that that's something they should do right at the front before they do any of the rest of the survey.
Right, and oftentimes you'd want to actually add before this a little description of what the survey is so that people actually know what that is. And so I consent. So I'll click on that. So then you can even add images or anything else, so multiple choice. Let's see. I do not consent. All right, so at that point, they could do that. You can take it as a required question, which it would be. And then I go and I click here on the add, and I can go on to my next question.
Wow. So what kind of limitations do they have on the number of questions?
None, as far as I've found.
Nice.
Yeah, so, and just to sort of show you, if I go back here, one of the nice things about this that I think mirrors sort of SurveyMonkey. SurveyMonkey has some nice sort of analytic stuff, but I would also say, if we look at this, once people take this and it generates a link at the end, you can look at the responses.
So it comes with some tools they can use to do analytics.
Exactly. So you know, this was an extra credit survey, so I have students there, but here are actually, you know, things that you could screenshot and actually put into your paper. So it creates data and charts for you based upon everything that you do.
Wonderful. And
yeah,
they can just import those right into their research
right.
papers.
And actually, I just copied it. So if you click here, you'll actually copy it and you can import it directly in.
Excellent. Excellent.
Yeah.
Wow, with so much expandability, you can kind of go hog wild with that. But as you said earlier, they should keep it short.
Right. I think the idea, just because you can write 50 questions and send it out to 750 people doesn't mean that that's a good idea to write 50 questions and send it out to 750 people. So narrowing, you know, the focus of your survey and narrowing the population is always a good idea.
So is it possible when using Google Forms to import graphics? Let's say you wanted to get their response to a purported photograph of Sasquatch or something.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the lovely things. So if we were to go back to that sample survey that I was creating, it's incredibly simple. So let's uh, go back into it. So say, yeah, on my second question, I wanted to add an image. So I can import questions. I can add an image down here. You can see that the image, the sort of universal image icon is right there. And if you
Nice.
have it on your machine, you can put it right in.
Marvelous. Wow. So this really is fully configurable. They can pretty much cook up any kind of survey their imagination yields.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's the one thing I would say is that, I'm not sure about, with Qualtrics and everything else, you can really sort of say that it's a completely secure thing. I mean, the level of security for this may not be as high as, um, say, those, but, it would take some effort because you're going to distribute a unique URL for the survey.
And so maybe also a good piece of advice would be that as soon as their survey is complete, they should take it down from whatever storage media
Right.
it's located on.
Also, let me see if I can find it here. So when you actually have, when you're setting it up and you're sending it out, you can configure it so that people do not see the results, that only you do. And that's absolutely something you want to do.
Oh, for confidentiality.
Exactly. And there's a whole slew, I'm guessing, if you go to YouTube and type in, Google Forms and surveys, there'll be a lot of sage advice offered.
Well, so to wrap this up, whether they use SurveyMonkey, Google Forms, or something really conventional, like say just an emailed questionnaire, are there any other things that students should think about in terms of time demands or how long it takes to analyze the data they get, or what to do if they have data that just don't seem to yield anything useful?
Well, I mean, one of the things is, it does take some time to actually crunch the data after you get it. So you don't want to save this as the very last thing that you're doing. I'd recommend starting it, is the final draft due in the final week of class, Doug?
Uh, yeah, it will be due in the 10th week.
Okay. So, I would say you want to get something up and running by week 5. You want to give yourself 2 to 3 weeks to collect. Then you'll want to stop the survey and you'll want to look at it and analyze and see what the patterns are. If you end up with something where the patterns are negligible, then I guess you always have that question of, uh, do I actually want to use this? In my experience, that's not really the issue. What is the issue is you often find that what you assume to be true is not necessarily true. And actually, that's kind of what this class is all about, is that, you have to check your assumptions at the door and begin to understand that when we get to urban legends, hoaxes, and conspiracy theories, um, what you first believe may not be the best thing to believe.
Yeah, well, that is kind of a take-home lesson of this whole study, isn't it?
Yeah,
Well, thank you so much. This was, I think, super useful, very productive for our students, gives them lots of examples and things to think about. Can students contact you if they have any questions?
absolutely. Feel free to share my email and be happy to respond. And yeah, and I think your students know, but they should know that they're in excellent hands. I could not imagine a better person to do this sort of teaching in this particular time than you, Doug Bradley. So, you know, they're going to be
Well, oh,
they're
go
going to be,
on.
no, they're going to be well served. And I think they're going to, it's funny what you learn by doing this, and the nature of belief becomes really apparent. And I think that's always something important to think about.
And I think we could also end on a positive note that you and I probably have gotten some of the best research papers we've ever received in this
Yeah.
particular class on this particular topic.
Absolutely. I think that, the level of thought, it goes oftentimes deeply philosophical, and it's meaningful. And I think when you are researching the weird, as we say in the subtitle of the book, it gives you permission to really think deeply and to think as a real intellectual, as a public intellectual. I mean, these are important topics.
And to think about thinking, the ultimate exercise,
Absolutely.
and mentally at least.
Yeah, metacognition everywhere.
There you go. Well, thank you, Dr. Chris Dean, for helping us out today.
My pleasure.
All right.